Dawn rose over Normandy on July 27, 1944. Mist clung to the hedgerows, carrying the smell of smoke from the night's artillery fire. A single 88-millimeter round tore through the side of an American Sherman, its metallic shriek echoing across the narrow fields. For any crew inside a tank like this, that impact usually meant the end. A Panther gunner from the 2nd SRS Panzer Division, Das Reich, kept his eye fixed on the sight. He waited for the fire, the pillar of flame that always followed a successful penetration, the moment when steel turned into a burning coffin. But the Sherman did not burn. The turret began to turn, slow, steady, deliberate. Like the shot that had just pierced its armor was nothing more than a glancing blow. Inside the Panther, the loader froze, his hands suspended over the next round. Everything they had been taught, everything they had witnessed from Tunisia to the Eastern Front, told them this tank should already be engulfed in fire. Hidden beneath layers of American armor was a change so small it left no trace on the surface, yet powerful enough to fracture an entire doctrine. A sealed ammunition system filled with liquid, a detail German intelligence had never detected. Today we follow the story of Wet-Stowage, the quiet innovation that kept Shermans from becoming funeral pyres, and the unseen force that helped unravel German expectations during the summer of 1944. Morning mist drifted across the rolling fields near Saint-Denis-le-Gas, its pale haze clinging to broken walls and shattered hedgerows. The air still carried the scent of last night's bombardment. American armored columns pushed south through the narrow lanes, advancing under the first light of Operation Cobra. Hidden within the thickets and sunken roads, German tank crews waited. Bocage terrain forced close-range combat, and for the Panther and PaK-40 crews, this was an advantage. They knew their guns could pierce a Sherman with ease. They believed they knew what followed such a hit. On July 27, an 88-millimeter round from a Panther of the 2nd SS Panzer Division, Das Reich, punched through the hull of an M4A1, moving along a hedgerow line. The impact was a clean penetration. The German gunner held the sight steady, waiting for the familiar burst of flame. But the Sherman did not ignite. It shuddered, shifted, and began to pivot its turret toward the ambush. Inside the Panther, the loader froze, his hand still gripping the next round, stunned at the absence of fire. Years of doctrine and experience had conditioned them to expect a blaze after a hit like that. In that quiet moment, the German crew witnessed something they had not imagined possible: a Sherman surviving a penetration to its ammunition stowage. The battlefield had not changed. The tanks had. To understand this moment, we trace back to the North African battles a year earlier. At Kasserine Pass in February 1943, American Shermans burned across the valley floor. German 75mm and 88mm guns tore through the M4's armor, and inside the crew compartments, a more deadly chain reaction erupted. Shermans did not simply get knocked out. They became infernos. Of over 300 American tanks engaged, almost 200 were destroyed. British researchers recorded that 65% of penetrated Shermans burned completely. American studies showed figures approaching 80% in some engagements. The problem lay not in gasoline, as many believed, but in the way ammunition was stored. 70 or more rounds sat in exposed racks along the hull sides. When fragments from a penetrating round struck the propellant charges, the entire supply ignited in seconds. Crews understood the grim reality. A single penetration could mean death for everyone inside. Sherman's reputation as a burning coffin grew from these fields. After the North African campaign, the Ordnance Department and the Tank Automotive Center collected burned-out Shermans to determine why they had failed. What they found overturned long-standing beliefs. Gasoline was not the primary cause. Ammunition propellant was. The exposed racks positioned along the sponsons acted as fuel for internal explosions. Once struck, the propellant ignited violently, turning the fighting compartment into an uncontrollable fire. The conclusion was clear. The tank did not need thicker armor first. It needed safer ammunition storage. This realization set the stage for one of the most impactful yet understated innovations of the war. In November 1943, during a meeting of the tank board, a chemical engineer from DuPont introduced a proposal that initially sounded absurd. What if the ammunition was surrounded by liquid? At first, engineers imagined an entire fighting compartment filled with water, a disastrous concept. But as the idea evolved, a more elegant solution emerged. Double-walled ammunition containers placed low in the hull, with the space between filled with water or a specialized suppressant. The logic was simple. If fragments pierced the ammunition bins, the liquid would spill into the area and smother ignition before a fire could spread. The idea quickly shifted from improbable to promising. Within weeks, designs were drafted to relocate ammunition to the hull floor and enclose each cluster of rounds in liquid-filled jackets. This would become the Wet-Stowage system. By late 1943, the first trials began at Ardennes Proving Ground. Captured German 75 and 88 millimeter guns were fired at both traditional dry stowage bins and the new wet stowage bins. The results were stark. Dry storage erupted in flames in 73% of hits. Wet storage ignited in only 15%. Film footage, later declassified, showed dry ammunition shooting pillars of fire, while wet stowage bins produced faint smoke that dissipated almost instantly. For the ordnance engineers, the data was undeniable. Reducing internal fires by more than half could save thousands of lives and preserve hundreds of tanks. Factories across the United States prepared to shift production. Press Steel Car Company and Fisher Tank Arsenal reworked their assembly lines. Whole floors were redesigned, sponson racks were removed, wiring, hydraulics, and turret mechanisms were rerouted. Ammunition was lowered into newly constructed floor wells surrounded by liquid-filled cavities. By January 3, 1944, the first M4A1 76W rolled off the line. The W stood for wet, though few understood its significance at the time. By spring, hundreds of these tanks were in England, waiting. This change did not make the Sherman appear different. It altered nothing in silhouette or profile. And precisely because of this, German intelligence remained unaware of the revolution happening beneath the turret basket. German engineers had thoroughly evaluated Shermans captured in Tunisia. Their diagrams, reports, and tactical recommendations became standard doctrine throughout Panther units. Aim for the sponsons, ignite the ammunition, force the vehicle to burn. These assessments were circulated widely. Training centers in Putlos and Paderborn taught them as dogma. Anti-tank units marked Sherman weak points in red on range cards. But the analysis was based on Shermans built before wet stowage existed. No new intact Shermans were captured in 1944. Most vehicles recovered were burned-out hulks from earlier models. Germany lacked the resources and the organizational structure to maintain an updated technical intelligence cycle. Thus, on the eve of Operation Cobra, the Wehrmacht stepped into Normandy armed with data already obsolete. The arrival of wet stowage Shermans coincided with the moment American forces pushed hardest across the bocage. German defenses, built on the assumption that Shermans would ignite reliably, began to falter under the weight of unexpected outcomes. Shermans were being penetrated without burning, crews were surviving, tanks were being dragged back, repaired, and returned to battle in hours. The German war diaries began to record confusion. Hits that should have ended engagements did not. Penetrations that should have caused explosions produced only smoke. A technological change the Germans never identified was beginning to erode the very foundation of their tactical planning. Wet stowage Shermans did not dominate the battlefield through firepower. They altered the aftermath of being hit. A tank that might have burned now had a chance to retreat. A crew that might have died now had a chance to survive. A division that expected debilitating losses now maintained operational strength. In a war of attrition and momentum, survivability mattered as much as lethality. This invisible transformation, hidden under the turret floor, unmentioned in intelligence briefings, unnoticed by the enemy, reshaped the armored war in France. The survival of a tank became more than a technical detail. It became a factor that influenced strategy, operations, and ultimately, the collapse of German expectations. At 0938 hours on July 25, 1944, the sky above St. Lo erupted. Waves of American bombers released the heaviest tactical bombardment yet seen in the European theater. The earth shook with each detonation. Entire hedgerows vanished beneath clouds of dust and smoke. The countryside, once a maze of green walls and narrow lanes, became a scarred landscape filled with shattered trees and overturned soil. Below that choking veil, American tank battalions moved into position. Shermans from the 2nd and 3rd Armored Divisions stood ready, many of them equipped with the still unknown Wet-Stowage system. Their engines throbbed in the cratered ground, awaiting the moment the bombardment ceased. When the final explosions faded, the assault began. Infantry pushed through the gap at St. Lo. Shermans rolled forward, their tracks grinding over debris still hot from the blasts. At first, German resistance seemed broken, but deeper within the bocage, units of Panzer Lehr and SS Panzer divisions reorganized, pulling back their remaining Panthers and anti-tank guns into ambush positions. This was the moment German tank crews had been trained for. Close-range engagements in hedgerow country favored Panther optics, gun penetration, and defensive fire. Yet something was different, something they could not explain. On the morning of July 26th, Panthers engaged the leading Shermans of the 67th and 33rd Armored Regiments. Their gun crews saw clear penetrations. They watched armor plates peel back. They saw the familiar burst of smoke, but they did not see fire. Shermans jolted, stalled, then backed out of the kill zone under their own power. Others returned later, patched on the battlefield by maintenance teams, and rejoined the advance as if nothing had happened. Captured German reports from these days mention a strange resilience among American tanks. Hits that should have caused catastrophic explosions produced only small smoke leaks. Targets that should have been destroyed withdrew and reappeared within 48 hours. The German gunners' rule, penetration equals kill, was beginning to collapse. For Panther crews, these moments created a kind of cognitive dissonance. They trusted their guns. They trusted their doctrine. They trusted their training. A successful hit to a Sherman sponson was supposed to ignite the ammunition racks inside. Years of experience on the Eastern Front reinforced that belief. Shermans, like T-34s, had a reputation for burning quickly. Yet in Normandy, the expected fireballs never materialized. Panther loaders, reaching for another round, often hesitated. Commanders shifted uneasily in their cupolas, unsure if the enemy tank had truly been disabled. Some crews gave up their firing position too early, expecting the American vehicle to detonate on its own. These moments of uncertainty echoed through the German lines. Doctrine was failing them. The bocage was not just a landscape, it was a series of traps. Every hedgerow concealed firing lanes, choke points, dead ground, and ambush angles invisible until the last moment. For American tankers, the terrain forced them into range where Panther and PaK-40 guns were most lethal. For German tankers, this terrain allowed prepared shots at vulnerable angles. But the disadvantage that once made Shermans burn in seconds was no longer decisive. Wet-Stowage turned deadly penetrations into survivable wounds. Instead of roaring fires, only faint vapor escaped from the newly designed floor bins. In several engagements, German officers reported shooting at the same tank multiple times because they were unsure whether previous hits had been effective. The battlefield became a contest not only of firepower, but of perception. In the days following the breakthrough, German armored units faced an accelerating problem. Shermans were being repaired faster than German tanks could be repositioned. American divisions sustained momentum. German forces struggled to establish coherent defensive lines. A Panther might disable a Sherman at noon, only for that same vehicle to reappear the next day. A PaK-40 might score a perfect hit, only for the target to vanish behind cover instead of burning. A company commander might report 3 kills, only for reconnaissance the next morning to report those vehicles moving again. Attrition no longer behaved as German doctrine predicted. The mathematical foundation of their defensive planning had become unreliable. As one officer wrote after his headquarters was overrun, "The enemy's tanks do not diminish." Behind the front line, American recovery and repair battalions worked at extraordinary speed. Tanks that would have been lost entirely in North Africa were now repaired in the field. A penetration that once meant total destruction now meant a patch plate and a day's work in a forward maintenance yard. Third Army reported recovering 67% of knocked-out Shermans during Cobra. Nearly 70% of tanks that would have burned in 1943 returned to duty with wet-stowage protection. This kept American armored strength artificially high in the eyes of German intelligence. Units that should have been depleted after days of fighting still fielded nearly full complements of vehicles. In an armored war, momentum decides outcomes. And momentum comes from tanks that can continue fighting. Wet-Stowage gave American armor precisely that. The turning point of Operation Cobra was not just the bombardment. It was not just the tactical skill of American divisions. It was not only German exhaustion. It was the quiet reality that German hits no longer produced the expected results. Shermans kept fighting. Crews survived. Vehicles returned. Panther and Pak-40 rounds still penetrated. But the chain reaction inside the tank, the reaction German gunners relied on, had been severed. This was the moment the war in Normandy began tilting irreversibly. A revolution in survivability, invisible from the outside, had taken hold. And from this moment forward, Germany fought an armored war based on assumptions that no longer match reality. Inside any Sherman, the moment an armor-piercing round tore through the hull felt unreal. There was a sharp metallic scream, a violent shock wave, a burst of scorching dust that filled the compartment like a blinding storm. Crews had been conditioned to expect the inevitable. A hit to the fighting compartment meant fire. Fire meant detonation. Detonation meant death. From Tunisia to Sicily, crews watched Shermans burn within seconds. Some tanks erupted so quickly that men inside never left their seats. Others turned into white-hot furnaces with turret hatches welded shut by flame. Every tanker carried those memories. Every tanker knew the rule. If the ammunition is struck, the vehicle becomes a coffin. That assumption shaped the thought process of every American crewman entering Normandy. They did not fear the penetration. They feared the fire that always came next. But in the summer of 1944, something shifted. Near Camprand, a Sherman of the 33rd Armored Regiment took a direct hit into its ammunition area. The crew braced for the fire. They waited for the roar that would engulf the hull. It never came. Instead, a thin white vapor drifted across the compartment. The floor shuddered. Fragments ricocheted off steel plates. A warm spray of liquid struck the loader's boots. The gunner remembered later, "I expected the flash. I expected the blast." But there was nothing except smoke. The turret continued to function. The intercom crackled back to life. The driver, stunned but conscious, shifted the tank out of the kill zone. For the first time, the crew realized that a struck ammunition bin did not have to end their lives. They were alive inside a tank that should have consumed them. This was the new reality created by Wet-Stowage. Before Wet-Stowage, a Sherman hit in the sponson racks had an average of 7 to 11 seconds before a catastrophic fire erupted. 7 seconds was too short to react, too short to escape, too short for any chance of survival. With Wet-Stowage, the calculation changed completely. Penetrations produced limited ignition. Smoke replaced flame. Fire spread slowed drastically. Internal temperature spikes were brief. Ammunition rarely detonated. The crew had time, seconds that felt like stolen life. Tanks that once turned into charred ruins now withdrew behind cover. Vehicles that should have been total losses became repair jobs. Crews that should have died were treated for burns, concussions, or shrapnel instead. The battlefield equation had been rewritten without the enemy realizing it. For German gunners, the absence of flame disrupted their belief system. A Panther firing from a hedgerow might achieve a perfect side penetration. Crews would watch through their sights, waiting for the flash. Instead, they saw a puff of faint vapor. The Sherman lurched backward. Sometimes it even pivoted to return fire. Reports from Pak-40 crews describe these moments with growing frustration. Penetrations succeed, destruction does not. Doctrine taught them that a Sherman hit in the ammunition racks was finished. In Normandy, the hit no longer guaranteed the kill. Confusion began to shape decisions. Some crews fired additional rounds at already disabled vehicles. Others relocated too early, believing the first hit was sufficient. Some hesitated, unsure if the target had been destroyed. A psychological fracture was spreading through panzer units. The hedgerow country turned every engagement into close-quarters combat. A single turn in a sunken lane might bring a Sherman face-to-face with a Panther at less than 100 meters. In one clash near Cambrai, a leading Sherman was penetrated immediately. The expected fire never appeared. The commander remained conscious long enough to order a withdrawal. The gunner swung the turret toward the ambush. The tanks behind maneuvered into firing positions. Seconds gained from surviving the initial hit allowed the American formations to break out of the kill zone, reorganize, and counterattack. If this engagement had occurred with dry stowage Shermans, the first tank would have erupted in flames, blocking the lane and trapping the entire column. Survival opened tactical possibilities that had never existed before. A penetration into a wet stowage compartment produced a distinct pattern, a sharp blast of overpressure. White or gray vapor escaping through the new ammunition wells. Fragments bouncing off internal plates. A warm splash of suppressant mixture. Stunned, disoriented crewmen coughing through dust and vapor. Medical reports described burns from heated liquid, puncture wounds from spalling, temporary hearing loss, shock symptoms from sudden impact. But the most important detail was this. The crew could still move. The hatches could still open. The vehicle could often still drive. In the older Shermans, the compartment became a sealed furnace. In the new ones, it became survivable chaos. On August 2nd, Panthers and Panzer IVs engaged a line of American Shermans near Percy. They scored multiple penetrations within minutes. Smoke drifted from the struck vehicles. German commanders recorded 3 apparent kills. Their units advanced accordingly, assuming the enemy armor was neutralized. But recovery teams had already moved in. 2 of the 3 Shermans were towed to safety, patched with steel plates, refueled, and returned to service before sunset. When those tanks reappeared in combat, the German after-action notes reflected disbelief. Tanks previously destroyed are again observed. Wet stowage created the illusion that American forces possessed more tanks than they actually did. The enemy fought an army they could not accurately count. Panther and Tiger units entered Normandy with strong faith in their weapons. Their guns could defeat any Sherman at combat range. Their doctrine emphasized precision and lethality. But as the summer continued, unexplained survivals undermined that confidence. Gunners no longer trusted that a successful hit would remove a vehicle from battle. Commanders second-guessed penetration reports. Crew morale suffered as perception diverged from results. In armored warfare, belief in one's weapons is as vital as the weapons themselves. That belief was cracking. And it cracked because of something no German ever saw, a layer of liquid hidden inside an ammunition bin. Wet stowage did not transform the Sherman into a heavily armored tank. Panthers still penetrated at distance. Tigers still tore through the front plate. PaK-40s still destroyed tanks at choke points. Mines still disabled tracks and hulls. But the pattern changed. Fewer fires, more wounded survivors, more tanks recovered, more vehicles restored. More veteran crews returning to battle. Third Army maintenance battalions recorded a recovery rate of 67% during Cobra. Vehicles that once became charred wrecks now continued the fight after repairs lasting only hours. The impact was cumulative. Every survival amplified American strength. German operational planning relied on predicted attrition curves. A certain number of hits equaled a certain number of kills. A certain number of kills reduced an armored division's combat effectiveness. Wet stowage invalidated those equations. A brigade expecting to face weakened American spearheads instead encountered full-strength units. Counterattacks launched under assumptions of enemy depletion ran straight into intact armored battalions. As one officer wrote after Percy, "The enemy's strength does not decay as anticipated." His observation was accurate. His explanation was wrong. He assumed reinforcements had arrived. He never imagined that the same tanks, struck earlier, had returned. Many American tankers later described the same revelation. A gunner from the 67th Armored Regiment recalled, "I waited for the fire. When it didn't come, everything changed." A driver said, "Smoke came through the hole, but I was still alive. I drove us out. We were supposed to be dead." Survival transformed mindset. Crews fought with renewed determination because they understood they had a chance to live through hits that once condemned them. Every surviving tanker became a carrier of experience. Knowledge passed from crew to crew. Skill accumulated instead of being lost to flame. Wet stowage preserved more than vehicles. It preserved expertise. At Percy, German units attempted to close a breach created by the American advance. They believed the Shermans ahead of them were heavily depleted. They expected minimal resistance. Instead, American armored elements regrouped and counterattacked with more tanks than German commanders thought possible. Penetrations achieved that morning had not translated into permanent kills. Vehicles written off in German reports had been repaired or replaced within hours. This encounter marked a turning point in perception. For the first time, German field officers recorded that American tank numbers appeared unnaturally high. They did not know it yet, but they were fighting a force sustained by an unseen advantage. An advantage created inside steel hulls, inside dark compartments, inside the very moments when men once believed their lives would end. In early August 1944, German headquarters near Mortain gathered reports from shattered frontline units. Officers searched for patterns, anything that could explain why American armor remained strong despite repeated penetrations. One logistics officer remarked bitterly, "The numbers do not add up." The Wehrmacht believed that Sherman losses should be far higher. Their assumptions were based on the North African experience, where Shermans burned in alarming numbers. But in Normandy, American armored strength appeared steady. The absence of burning wrecks confused German analysts. Tanks hit the previous evening were spotted again the following afternoon. Columns that should have been thinned by attrition advanced at full strength. The truth sat hidden beneath layers of armor, liquid-filled ammunition bins, quietly preventing the fires German doctrine relied upon. Germany entered the final phase of the campaign, fighting a war shaped by outdated information. On August 7th, during Operation Ludic, German commanders launched a desperate counterattack aimed at cutting off the American breakout. They believed the armored units at Saint-Lô had been weakened by days of fighting. Reports indicated several Shermans had been knocked out along the approach routes. Yet most of those tanks were not destroyed. They had been towed away at night, patched, refueled, and returned to their battalions before the counterattack began. When German armored spearheads struck Hill 314, they encountered defenses far stronger than anticipated. Shermans that had been penetrated earlier that week were back in action. American formations held their lines, reinforced by surviving crews and repaired vehicles. The German plan unraveled quickly, built on assumptions that no longer matched battlefield reality. As American forces broke through the Falaise region, German command structures suffered from a widening gap between observation and interpretation. Some officers blamed poor ammunition quality. Some suspected American steel had improved. Others believed Allied air power disrupted their assessments. No one considered that the ammunition inside the Sherman had been relocated, enclosed and immersed in suppressant liquid. The Wet-Stowage system remained invisible, physically hidden and conceptually unimagined. Germany attempted to respond to the changing battle, but each move came too late. Shermans remained operational. Crews survived. American armored strength held steady through engagements that should have depleted it. Strategic miscalculations grew more severe as the speed of the advance accelerated. By September 1944, American and German armored units clashed across the rolling hills of Lorraine. The fog, the long firing lanes, and the soft ground created conditions ideal for ambush and counter-ambush. During the Battle of Ericourt, the 4th Armored Division faced the newly formed 113th Panzer Brigade. Panther scored multiple penetrations at medium and short range. Their reports noted clean hits, well-placed shots, and tactical advantage. But the aftermath did not support their conclusions. Of the 151 Shermans knocked out, only 41 became permanent losses. The remaining 110 were repaired, many within a single week. German staff officers believed the division had suffered catastrophic losses. The next day, they were stunned to find American armor counterattacking with unexpected strength. Wet-Stowage had altered the rhythm of armored warfare. Recovery replaced destruction, repair replaced loss. Survivability became a force multiplier Germany could neither predict nor counter. In December 1944, as snow blanketed the Ardennes, Germany launched its final major offensive in the West. Joachim Peiper's Kampfgruppe led the initial spearhead, relying on Panther and Tiger tanks to break through American lines. In the opening clashes, German guns performed as expected. Penetrations were achieved. Hits landed exactly where training dictated. But Shermans that should have burned continued moving. Some were struck twice and still reversed out of the kill zone. Others returned fire seconds after being penetrated. Peiper later admitted his frustration. We hit them where they should explode. They did not explode. For the first time, German armored units realized that penetrations, no matter how precise, were no longer decisive. The offensive slowed and eventually stalled under the weight of this unexpected resistance. In January 1945, German forces overran American positions near Herlesheim and captured several M4A3, 75W, and M4A3, 76W Shermans intact. Crews inspected them, started them, even used them in combat. They examined the ammunition racks but failed to understand the purpose of the double-walled containers and the liquid they held. To their eyes, these appeared to be structural features, reinforcements or shock absorbers. None recognized them as fire suppression systems. Even when handling the very tanks whose survivability confounded them, German units never discovered the modification that shaped their defeat. It was an intelligence failure layered in plain sight. By early 1945, all Sherman production lines included Wet-Stowage. M4A3E8 EZ8 entered service in large numbers. M4A3E2 Jumbo led assaults on fortified towns. Crew survival rates reached their highest levels of the war. American armored divisions advanced with confidence built on experience, cohesion, and growing technical superiority. Panzer units, meanwhile, suffered from chronic shortages of fuel, spare parts, and trained crews. A tank war that once seemed equal had become a conflict defined by endurance. And endurance favored the side whose tanks could be penetrated without burning. Post-war studies by the U.S. Operations Research Office documented the full impact of wet stowage. Shermans with dry stowage, 60 to 80% burned after penetration. High crew fatality rates, rapid depletion of armored strength. Shermans with wet stowage, 10 to 15% burned. More than 70% of penetrated tanks were recoverable. Over 5,000 crewmen survived who would otherwise have died. Approximately 1,000 tanks avoided catastrophic fire. A small adaptation, a layer of liquid surrounding ammunition, shifted the balance of survival across the entire European theater. The numbers exposed what German commanders never understood. The enemy did not lose tanks as quickly as they expected. Post-war analysis of German war diaries, field reports, and personal memoirs revealed a striking pattern. No mention of wet stowage. No recognition of the change. No tactical adjustments to counter it. Panzer aces wrote detailed accounts of ammunition behavior in enemy tanks, yet never once described the reduced burn rates. Officers from Panzer Lehr, 2nd SS Panzer, and 116 Panzer Division recorded inconsistencies but never identified the cause. The innovation succeeded not through secrecy but through subtlety. It left no external signature. It changed no silhouette. It announced itself only through the absence of fire. That absence rewrote the course of every armored engagement from Normandy to the Rhine. The story of wet stowage carries enduring lessons. Minor changes can yield strategic consequences. A few dozen gallons of suppressant liquid reshape survivability in armored warfare. Knowledge matters as much as technology. An enemy unable to recognize a change cannot adjust to it. Survival is a form of combat power. Each surviving crew returned with experience that strengthened their unit. Practical solutions can outweigh ambitious engineering. The United States solved a lethal flaw without redesigning the tank itself. Wars are often influenced by what does not happen. Fires that never ignited, explosions that never occurred, catastrophes that never unfolded. Wet stowage was not a weapon, it was a shield, quiet, unseen, and underestimated, yet decisive. By preventing the burning of ammunition, it preserved lives, maintained momentum, and allowed American armored divisions to fight at full strength when the war demanded it most. In the final months of World War II, a simple innovation helped secure victories across fields, towns, and river crossings. Victories shaped not by spectacle, but by survival.